Good evening and welcome to the Corte Madera Planning Commission for Wednesday, November 9th, this unusual day for a meeting. Calling this to order, and would you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Kenny?
Here.
Commissioner Bundy?
Here.
Chair Chase?
Here.
Vice Chair Rizzo?
Here.
Commissioner Bandel?
Here.
Thank you, and please join me in a salute to the flag. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. At this time in every meeting, we open the meeting to public comment for that which is not on the agenda tonight. So if you're in the room and you have something to say for 3 minutes or less, you may step up to the microphone, or if you're online, you need to raise your hand. Tracy will let you in. So I'm not seeing either at this point in time. So we'll close that public comment for that which is not on the agenda. And since we have nothing on consent, continued hearings, or new hearings, we're going to go direct to a business item tonight. And this is titled as Housing Element Rezoning Workshop. This is a discussion of draft zoning ordinance amendments to allow greater housing density and larger buildings on the town's housing opportunity sites, consistent with the town's draft housing element update 6th cycle. That's a lot. So who's going to introduce this item?
I think I'm going to do the introduction, and then, as Martha and I usually do, I'll hand it over to Martha, and we'll both be available for questions from the commission. So good evening.
Good evening.
Chair Chase and commissioners. Nice to see you this evening. So really just to provide some context for the discussion this evening, and just so everybody is aware, this is a workshop. We're titling it a workshop, which means there will not be any decisions made this evening by the Planning Commission, but we are looking for some comments, any questions, get some clarifying questions out there from the commission. And if there's any modifications or changes to what we have drafted in front of you tonight, we'd love to hear that now so that we can actually prepare responses to those comments and suggestions and incorporate it into a draft zoning amendment, which we'll talk about in a second, for your formal consideration at the December 13th Planning Commission hearing. And as you know, commissioners, and maybe Commissioner Kenny hasn't been with us throughout the entire process, but we are working within the confines of a state law with respect to the housing element and timeline and deadline for actually accomplishing certain tasks within the state law parameters. And so this really is sort of now, as you know, we've done a lot of outreach and community meetings to sort of prime the town and the commission and the town council ultimately for certain ordinance amendments that will be required for us to meet our RENA requirements that the state through ABAG has sort of provided to us. And so that's really what this meeting is about. And the draft ordinance that you have in front of you is really implementing the vision that we laid out and that was been sort of confirmed and by the town council, the planning commission in the past, in terms of our strategy for how to ensure that we are going to meet the requirements of state law with respect to the regional housing needs allocation that the state has provided, and through ABAG has provided the town, and to meet some of the housing goals that we all have just discussed and talked about through this process. So you can go to the next slide there, Tracy, actually. Yeah, that's perfect. So just a little bit of context, the focal point of tonight's discussion, while the draft housing element is out in HCD land for review, which is the full 500-page document with a bunch of policies and programs. Really, the strategy for meeting our regional housing needs allocation is the rezoning of several properties as described on the map and as we've discussed in several community workshops in the past that you see here in front of you. This is actually what was in the draft housing element that was sent to HCD in August. And, you know, and this is, which was consistent with our meetings throughout the last year or so with the community as well, or ultimately arrived to it with the community and planning commission. So the next slide, please. Since that release of the draft, one change to note is that we have eliminated the site that was previously site 1, 601 Tamalpais from our consideration of from the rezoning proposal, but also from one of our, you know, including it in our housing opportunity site list to meet RENA. That was really because of conversations that Martha had with the property owner, myself, and their lack of interest in really developing housing at the site. In fact, they're more proactive about redeveloping the existing building for commercial uses. And also, of course, as we heard in earlier in the, I think it was more like the late spring of last year and in the summer, concerns from neighbors that they expressed at that time of the redevelopment possibilities for housing on that site. So that's been removed. Staff felt that was perfectly okay. I mean, it was not going to preclude really the wasn't going to put a roadblock up or sort of preclude us from meeting the goals of the RENA, because it was actually not going to produce a lot of units in any case. I think we had about 10 units or 9 or 10 units, which when you're looking at 874, so it's a small fraction of that. And obviously our RENA numbers, which we'll get to in a second, are like 725. I don't want to go through all of it, but anyways, this is now the table, the rezoning table that we've shown in the past, with a couple of updates. One, the removal of that 601 Tamalpais site, and also noting that site 341 Tamal Vista Boulevard, which we had previously listed at 30 units an acre, increasing that to 35 units an acre, just to be consistent with all the other orange development sites, and noting that sort of that level of density still can be accommodated within the sort of the massing that we've described in past meetings. So that those couple of changes, I think that ended up going from 30 to 35, ended up with how many more? 11 more units on that site, potential units. And all of this, of course, is potential development. We're not actually building the units, but just setting the rules under which development could occur. There's certainly a lot of interest in that site, as well as a couple of other sites. We've heard from many developers. It just seems to be that there's the Scandinavian Designs, which owns that site, is still, you know, has certain, I guess, not being privy to the actual conversations, but they certainly are, what I've heard is have a high price for the site, which certain housing developers feel makes it a little bit more challenging. But we've heard some creative ideas potentially for housing or mixed use development on that site as well. So that's just going to be an ongoing discussion between the property owner and others that are out there seeking to redevelop that site. So
Adam, is your microphone on?
Yes. Yes. So that table, as you can see, these are the rezoning rezonings or rezoning these 10 sites would produce 800 a potential for a maximum of 874 units, which again is consistent with essentially what we've already sent to HCD in the state in terms of the numbers we're seeking to facilitate. And I would just say that doesn't include, of course, the 100 ADUs that we're projecting could be developed within the next 10 years or so. Some units pursuant to SB 9 and a few other units of single family homes, I think is also the total allotment of sort of projected potential development in over the next decade. So that's the context. What we want to do for you tonight is walk you through sort of how we're envisioning these rezonings working. First and foremost, we've envisioned using an overlay, zoning overlays as our tool for accomplishing these rezonings, which allows us to really have a more targeted approach to rezoning individual properties rather than sort of a more widespread rezoning proposal throughout town. Zoning overlays essentially also still allow for underlying or the base zoning to be utilized if a owner wishes to do so, provided that the overlay will not kick you into an overlay requirement. So for example, if we can go to the next slide, please. This is just mapping and show you structurally how we're doing it. We have the base zoning, which is the basic colors of the zoning map that you see there. And then on top of that, there are several existing overlays already in town that have additional requirements for certain properties throughout town. So that, I think the next slide this slide still has it. So as you all know, Christmas Tree Hill, for example, has an overlay district, which has different requirements for design review, different rules and procedures for properties in those areas. So the way we're envisioning this working is we've talked about the 10 sites that we're seeking to rezone. What we would be doing would be creating an overlay specific to those 10 properties and specific for the purpose of meeting our housing element requirements. And so essentially we're calling this a housing element overlay zone. It would not change the underlying zoning. So if I don't have a pointer, but just let's just pick out, I don't want to focus too much on the colors, but the Macy's property, for example, which is purple, we're still going to show that as purple, but you're going to have essentially an overlay that would allow or require, in this case, allow more flexibility and more density if you seek to develop a housing, a mixed use project or residential uses on the site. But that doesn't mean that there has to be residential uses built on the site. Macy's could still retain its existing uses there, which is all commercial. They could redevelop that site with entirely commercial uses if that was indeed what they saw as the best use of that property at the densities currently allowed by zoning for the village, basically the village and the precise plan there. So we're not taking away any of the current regulations from these properties that we're seeking to rezone. We're adding to them in a sense. Does that, any questions on that? But I think that that's a fundamental way we're structuring this that I think is important to understand, so that property owners, certainly important for them to understand as well. Essentially, next slide.
I have a question.
Yes.
So would you say when you put an overlay on a piece of property, are you increasing the the rights kind of that they have for development, or are you decreasing them?
No, it's a great question because a lot of times overlays are used to be more limiting and be more
Stringent.
restrictive than the base zoning. And that's certainly what we see in a lot of our overlay districts in town currently. Whether that's the Christmas Tree Hill overlay district for the most part, which we've talked about being more restrictive in terms of the threshold for design review, ADUs, things like that are more restrictive. The Hillside Land Capacity District is another overlay in town, also more restrictive. In this case, we're using the overlay to actually provide more flexibility and more density, for example, should a property owner choose to do housing or residential development. So it's almost, we're using it as a way to incentivize the development of housing on these sites. But that's, yeah, oftentimes overlays are more restrictive. In this case, it's actually more flexible. So this is just graphically showing the 11 sites. Sorry, the 10. It's recent change. But the 10 sites, and the way we're breaking down the housing element overlay district is actually creating 3 different sub areas of that overlay district. So there's, not so creatively calling these HE1, HE2, and HE3, which are really 3 different sub areas within the overlay district where there are going to be different density requirements, levels, different heights, and essentially mostly are there other, those are the basic different setbacks perhaps around those different 3 sub areas. And the thinking is really, you know, this is, in a sense, I view it more as like long-term thinking. We're going to have additional cycles going forward. In the future, let's say 2032 to 2040, that cycle, the 7th cycle comes up, and there's another, we need to look at new sites for rezoning in order to meet the regional housing needs allocation. Theoretically, those sites could be added to these districts that are already created, or these sub areas that are already created without having to redo this sort of work in the future. But in any case, that's sort of how we've structured the overlay district, and it's in here. Next, I think the last slide in this is just sort of more, I guess, kind of graphically showing a little. This isn't the exact map, but we will be needing to create a map amendment in order to implement this rezoning, because the map will actually show that there are HE1, HE2, and HE3 sub areas or to the housing element overlay zones. And we'll probably just label it. I don't know, the colors aren't working here, but anyways, that's the structure and some of the context. And then I'm going to hand it over to Martha, unless you have questions on that aspect of how we're structuring it, and get into the details of the proposed draft again. Or you got the mic. You need the computers.
So this slide shows the 3 different sub areas that are being proposed: HE1, HE2, and HE3, and the different sites that would fall into these 3 different sub areas. So now we'll be kind of taking a look at the different development standards for all of the 10 sites. And the way we've kind of grouped this is there are some development standards that will apply to all 10 sites. It includes such things such as parking and public frontage requirements and lighting. And then there'll be development standards that will be specific to the 3 different sub areas in this density, height, open space requirements, and step back requirements. So these standards are all the same for all the sites that fall into the different sub areas. And then lastly, there are site-specific standards, which are, for the most part, setbacks. And in developing the rezoning, staff, has evaluated the existing context of the site to formulate the recommendations for the setbacks that are included. Okay, so to start with standards that would apply to all the sites, these are within, if you prefer to follow along on the ordinance, it is section 18181115. And so again, these apply to all sites. I haven't included all of the standards. I've just picked ones that I thought would be, most of interest to the commission, and you may have questions on. So parking, the parking that was included is the same of what's in the odds toolkit. So the requirement would be 1 parking space for a studio or 1 bedroom, and then 1.5 parking spaces for a 2-bedroom or more. We also include a guest parking space, and the guest parking space increases as there are more units. And we actually received feedback from a couple different developers and architects that the guest parking for the 16 or more units at 1.5 space is rather high and could be a barrier to development of some of these larger projects. So staff will be taking another look at that recommendation as we move forward. There's also a bicycle parking requirement, and the bicycle parking requirement is 1 space per unit. And those parking spaces for residential units are required to be within enclosed areas. And for larger multi-story buildings, the space can be distributed throughout the building. For instance, a space on each of the floors. And the ordinance also does include the allowance for a reduction to the number of bicycle parking spaces if a bike share program is provided to all the residents. Many of these lighting standards should look familiar. The first 2 appear on all design review applications that come before the commission. So there are lighting standards related to such things as bollards, when lighting needs to be turned off, the color temperature of the lighting, and also that it be dark sky compliant or meet the bug classifications. So these standards are also in the objective design and development standards toolkit, which we worked with Opticos on last year, as the commission is very familiar with. The ordinance includes a requirement for a public frontage requirement. And really the purpose of this requirement is to create a more kind of walkable area. Most of the sidewalks in town are only 4 feet, which can be challenging to have multiple people walking together on a sidewalk of that width. So what is being recommended are 2 different options. The first would be to do a 10-foot wide sidewalk with a tree grate embedded within the sidewalk. And the tree grate would be required to be 5 feet width in both directions. And then the second option would be to do an 8-foot clear sidewalk width, and then have a 4-foot planting strip. So we've included a couple graphics to demonstrate this. So this shows the 8-foot wide sidewalk and then a 4-foot planting area. And then this option is the 10-foot wide sidewalk that includes the tree grate that's embedded within the sidewalk. And we have an example of this on Tamil Vista in front of the Tamridge Apartments. So you can see it's a wider sidewalk that includes a tree grate. And something to note is, since most of the sidewalks are only 4 feet for these sites, a portion of their front property essentially would become part of this public improvement area. Okay, the next set of standards are standards that are specific to the 3 different sub areas. And for HE1, the density is 25 units an acre. And there are 2 sites in the HE1, and these are closer to residential areas. So the density and height are lower than what's being recommended for the other sites. The height is 35 feet, and there's a requirement for 200 square feet per unit of usable open space. And this would be things such as courtyards or plazas, balconies, barbecue areas, bocce ball courts, gyms, tennis courts, etc. And then a step back requirement is not proposed in this sub area since the buildings will not be as tall. In the HE2, the density is recommended is 35 units an acre with a maximum height of 50 feet. And the usable open space requirement is 150 square feet per unit. And a step back is required, a 10-foot step back above the third story. And then for the last zone, HE3, again, the density of 40 units, a maximum height of 70 feet, and then 100 square feet for open space recreational area, and then a step back above the fifth story. So we're now going to look at the site-specific standards, and I've provided a printout on the dais that shows these different sites, if it's easier for the commission to look at something closer up than on the screen. So site one, this shows both sites 1 and sites 5. And site 1 is in the HE2 district, and then site 5 is in the site 1 is in HE1 and site 5 is in HE2. So in some cases, staff has recommended a maximum front setback, and the purpose of that is to pull buildings closer to the street. In other cases, we have not recommended that because in certain cases, we don't think it's necessary. So for this site, Pfeiffer, there is both a minimum and a maximum front setback. The minimum is 12 and the maximum is 25 feet. And again, the purpose of that is to pull the building up. And then the recommended setbacks along Lucky and Nellen are 15 feet. And then an interior setback of 5 feet for site 5, site 5 adjacent to site 1. And as part of the work we did with the different workshops, we worked with Opticos to do some modeling. And this is conceptual only. There are, many different types of projects that could be developed on these sites, but this just kind of shows some of the concepts. For instance, it shows the 10-foot step back above the third story. And it also kind of demonstrates the buildings being pulled up closer to Pfeiffer. And for some of the sites, staff is recommending a minimum commercial requirement. And the site 5, the Pfeiffer, is one of the sites where there is a minimum requirement for commercial square footage. Okay, this shows site 2, which is 5651 Paradise Drive. For this site, staff is not recommending a maximum front setback. And this site exists within an existing commercial shopping center where there is shared parking and access. So it's not realistic to pull this building closer to the street. So the recommended front setback is 15 feet. And that's the same that's being recommended for the rear. And then 5 feet for the side. And this site includes 3 parcels. There are 2 small parcels that are owned by the town that are included within this site. And this is site 3, which is 41 Tamil Vista Boulevard. And in developing the recommended setbacks, staff looked at the existing MX zoning district. And that zoning district includes 2 different zones, a neighborhood zone and a highway zone. So we incorporated that into this ordinance, where the allowable height within the neighborhood zone would be less, it'd be a maximum of 35 feet. And then the height in the highway zone could be up to 50 feet. And again, that front portion of the site is adjacent to residential. There's residential across the street, so limiting the height of the building. The recommended setbacks is a minimum of 20 feet for the front and a maximum of 30 feet. And then a bit of a larger setback on the rear since it's adjacent to the highway, the minimum of 30 feet. And again, this mirrors the MX zoning district. And this, again, was developed by Opticos, which shows some of these concepts of pulling the buildings in front closer to the street. And you can also see they're of a smaller scale than the building located in the back adjacent to the highway. Site 4 is 400 and 500 Tamil Plaza. These two buildings it's an existing complex of 5 different buildings, and there's 5 different property owners. And these are the 2 properties that are in the back portion of that development. So this site is not adjacent to a street. So in the ordinance, it clarifies that the front property line is what is parallel to Tamil Vista. The recommended front setback is 10 feet with the recommended rear setback of 15 feet. And then this site is also adjacent to the trail. And staff is recommending a slightly larger setback for that area. This site 6, 5804 Paradise Drive. It's on the east side of town, kind of near Amy's. For this site, staff did not think it was necessary to pull a future building closer to the street. So there's only a minimum setback recommended of 15 feet, a maximum setback of 20 feet, and then 5-foot interior side setbacks. And then this shows the kind of potential scale and mass of a future development at that site, showing potentially the development of 2 different buildings, with maybe a smaller scale building in the front adjacent to Paradise and a little bit larger building in the rear portion. Site 7, 5750 Paradise Drive. This is 3 separate parcels. Again, for this site, staff did not think it was necessary to pull this building closer to the street. So there is no maximum front setback is being recommended. Just both a minimum for both the front setback and also the street side, both at 15 feet. The recommended rear setback of 15 feet as well. 100 Tamil Plaza. This is in the same complex where 400 and 500 Tamil Plaza are located. In this case, staff has recommended a maximum front setback. And the table in the ordinance lists that as 20 feet. That was an error. It should have been 25 feet as the maximum. So minimum of 12 feet and a maximum of 25 feet with the rear yard setback of 15 feet. And 240 Tamil Vista, which is where we are currently sitting. In this case, staff has recommended a maximum front setback and a maximum side street setback to pull the building adjacent to both Pfeiffer and Tamil Vista. You'll notice that for all the sites along Pfeiffer and Tamil Vista, that's where staff has recommended that maximum front setback to kind of activate the street. So the recommended minimum setback for the front and side is 12 feet and then 25 feet for the maximum with a 15-foot rear setback. And last but not least is the Macy's site. And I would like to say that we've had a couple of conversations with the Macy's team that's working on potential designs for the site, and they've raised some concerns with what was included in as figure B in the draft ordinance. So staff is continuing to work with them. Obviously the goal of all of these standards is to achieve design that fits in and is appropriate to the area, but also we don't want to preclude the development of the density, the allowed density. So the Macy's team is evaluating potential alternatives that staff will take into consideration. So there may be some changes to this. Adam, I don't know if you want to add in.
Well, yeah, I just think it's mostly around what we've heard is mostly around the zone A that I think is described, and maybe Martha will get into it, but it's mostly we had initially tried to pull or have a lower height adjacent to the ring road, essentially of 40 feet for a depth of 100 feet. And then so it sort of builds up the mass towards the center in terms of where zone B is more towards the center. And then obviously there's a connection point as well to the existing center. But in discussing with them, that 40-foot maximum height for a depth of 100 feet may interfere with some of the concepts that they've started to explore with some of the where they would place the masts and try to accomplish all the other programmatic requirements, including commercial and open space and things like that. So it's not getting rid of that, but there sort of a discussion has been about the depth maybe not being as deep, the 100 feet maybe being reduced in certain areas to 40 or 60 in certain locations, and then preserving that 100-foot max depth for that 40-foot height limit in sort of more of the San Clemente and frontage, where those intersections are in the highway frontages, not the highway frontage, but the highway off ramp. So anyways, that's just the preliminary discussions we've had, and we're going to continue to be working with them over the next weeks and as to sort of refine this concept here. But you know, it's sort of more recent development as we've gone through this process that actually we're hearing they have hired, for example, a development team, an architect who's working with them, and so that's just to show how this process is sort of facilitating that discussion on their side.
And then this site is a little unusual in that it has a requirement for a plaza area, a minimum of a 1/4 acre, to connect the residential component to the existing commercial area of the site. And there's also a requirement for additional 1/4 acre of open space that does not need to be contiguous on the site. This elevation kind of highlights the different height allowances within those different zones that were shown on the previous site, and again showing the step back of the upper floor being stepped back 10 feet. On the next steps, we're here this evening to hear feedback from the commission and the community, and staff will take feedback and continue to refine the draft ordinance. And we plan to return to the commission on December 13th with the zoning ordinance amendment, in addition to the update to the safety element and land use element, and also the CEQA component as well. And then our goal is to adopt the rezonings by January 31st, 2023. And one of the reasons to do so is to avoid the by right consequence. If the town does not adopt the rezonings by that date, and a future project comes in that includes 20% affordable units, then we would not be able to do design review. So if we do adopt it by that date, we can continue to use design review. We are limited though by the Housing Accountability Act that we cannot make changes to a project that would result in a decrease to the density. But obviously, you know, there could be changes to the design through that process.
Yeah, I think it's important while we're in this workshop setting as well, just to sort of lay out some of the, I think Martha mentioned one, the Housing Accountability Act. I mean, we're really trying to preserve our processes as we normally get to review projects, but there are limitations there. And so I think the idea and the goal is really to work together, setting these parameters, and through this process saying, here's the density we've been showing our community, here's the density we've been showing the planning commission, the town council. These are some of the massing. This is what we should be expecting down the road. And then we use our process to really just sort of highlight some, some of the potential modifications for transitions and, maybe where to focus some of the mass versus others, but it's not a process where we're talking about reducing density. It's not a process where we're talking about denying projects, because they're going to be compliant with our general plan and our housing element at that point. And really state law precludes us from going down that road of sort of picking projects apart to the point where they become smaller or less dense or denying them. So that's something important to note. I also want to point out that all of these, because there is the density bonus law as well, which we have to recognize exists in state laws. And so that while we're setting our maximum densities allowed and projecting a certain amount of development pursuant to our own local codes, the state has a density bonus law, which allows increases to those maximum densities, provided a certain level of affordable housing is built within those projects. And as the commission knows, our inclusionary housing ordinance that was recently updated requires a certain amount of housing affordability in these projects. So likely, and this is, we see this in other projects, they will be automatically sort of qualified for the density bonus. Sometimes that leads developers to actually build more units pursuant to that density bonus law. But other times it's actually just used to utilized for the concessions and the exceptions that developers can use to sort of modify some of the development standards that may inhibit the project or otherwise inhibit the project. And really the burden's on the town at that point to prove otherwise, and it's not, it's a high bar, so to speak, to really disallow those concessions and exceptions. So it's more and more, I mean, it just speaks to more and more the sort of the once we set our rules, the level of discretion we're going to have over these projects is lessened. But nonetheless, I think setting out this process and setting out some parameters for what we want to see and the types of development we think can be achieved within these envelopes and the heights and the setbacks, is still very valuable, because we can bring in people to the process already with, I think most people we've spoken to really do want to work with the town and want to have a good product that everybody can be happy about at the end of the day. So that's what we're trying to achieve through this process. The other thing just to note, we didn't highlight it here, just set it for the sake of time, but we did hear through the process that we really should think about how to attract either senior housing or residential care facilities for the elderly. And so there are provisions in here that are intended to try to, one, create development standards for those types of projects and products, and also by doing so, incentivizing them to a certain extent. I think for senior housing, we've put in a allowance for 5 units per acre more than what's allowed by the base zoning, proposed zoning. And then RCFEs or residential care facilities for the elderly, those are typically actually commercial uses, because they're not full dwelling units, each one. But we wanted to make sure we specified that those are still permitted in these overlay zones, and really would be, because they're not dwelling units, they aren't actually subject to some of the housing laws that I just spoke of. So that we could sort of talk about the appropriate size and density of those through a conditional use permit process. So that's how that works for those two uses. And there are some other, at the end, there's just, I think we have some provisions here we still want to require, as we have with large projects, preliminary review. So there would be sort of a workshop. We want that process to remain intact for these projects. Are some potential, some ability for some fee reductions potentially for affordable projects that exceed the base affordability requirements of the inclusionary ordinance. And I'll leave it there. So thank you. Thanks, Martha, for all the work and draft a lot of this and getting this down, and all of her time and energy of organizing this and getting this to this point. But we're here to answer questions and then hopefully take this to the next step, which would be a December 13th public hearing in front of the commission.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Martha. That's a good presentation. So we'll take it right back up here and see what questions the commissioners have for you guys. Margaret, what do you have?
Just as a point of reference, if you know, how tall is the Wind Cup building or whatever they're calling it now?
48 feet.
That's 48 feet. So if something was 70 feet, it would basically be double that.
No,
No,
well, 40, it's, what is that, 22 more feet on top of the
Okay.
48.
The tallest building is at the town center, right? With the offices above.
the town center building.
Yeah, so I think.
Oh, okay, that,
It's
I know that. big
60
building,
feet,
yeah.
Yeah,
How tall is that one?
about 60.
60, approximately 60.
60.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So the proposal is to allow something to be taller than that
It-
building
yeah,
Just at the Macy's site,
only.
only at the Macy's site. The majority of sites, the maximum height would be 50 feet. And then at the Macy's site, which is the only site in the HE3 sub area, it's a maximum height of 70 feet.
and actually the Tam Ridge project was a reference point for the 50 feet for a lot of the other properties that are
Mhm.
along Table Vista.
That's 40 feet. The
48
48, okay.
at the tallest. There's lower elements at the street, for example,
Okay.
on Table Vistas. So I think,
And you mentioned
Stories.
that one of the sites is where we're sitting now, is that right? Who owns this site?
So it's owned by a developer that acquired a handful of sites about a year ago. And this was the property owner that shortly after we issued the notice of preparation for the environmental impact report, provided
What?
for the CEQA analysis, they provided a comment letter that they wanted to be included. So we added this site and then also 100 Tamil Plaza, which the property owner owns both of those sites. So
So the proposal, I mean, I don't know what to call it, the program allows for a property owner to just basically kick out whoever has their business here now and develop it for some other purpose. Is that right? Yes.
yeah.
And that's true of any of the sites.
Yeah, yes, there aren't, as far as I know, any commercial tenant protections. There's certainly, if there's residential uses on site, there are some processes that would have, but I don't think any of our sites that were actually, the 10 sites have any existing residential units on them or residential tenants. So we're talking about commercial properties that, through this process or through other processes, the landlord obviously has ability through the lease structure, however that's structured. They could at the end of a lease change course and decide to do something different with the property.
That's my question.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Jim?
Yeah, I think they have to buy the leases out if. I'm sure that the new owner would have to work with whatever lease structures there or easements, as was what happened with this letter that came in.
Exactly.
You
Yeah.
can't just.
No,
what you
no.
Want to build.
Certainly there's.
But so I just wanted to continue just a little bit with the height of town center. Do we know how high that the step back is at town center's office side of the building? Because it feels like it could be a fifth, maybe above the fourth story. Maybe 45. I'm just curious if.
Don't, yeah. There's there's sort of like several components to that thing. There's the base.
Yeah,
where
and then if there's steps that come up, I'm just curious about, that massing, is it probably the best example of what we'll see from the.
Yeah, we haven't analyzed it to that level.
All right, yeah, okay.
Could, if that's helpful, we're happy to.
Yeah, it'd be nice to know what the
Try
depth is and, because 10 feet's really not a lot when you're 50 feet up in the air. And then do we know how tall the RH building is, which will be adjacent to this whole,
Yeah, it's 46, I believe, to the top,
46.
46 feet to the top of the.
And do we what, how has other jurisdictions treated the parking for visitors? Because I do feel the same way. I think 1.5 seemed a little steep to try to get that to work on a program.
I've
Is that
heard,
typical?
yeah, I think our standard's a little higher than other jurisdictions. I've heard that one space for every 8 units or one space for 5. But the 1.5 seems to be higher than most other standards. And we, as part of the process, we can evaluate other guest parking requirements and refine that.
Do you think that you would align the odds document with that, or is that now part of our?
So what was in the draft ordinance matches the odds toolkit.
Yeah, now it does,
It-
but would you, in retro, I mean, would you align it in the future if it did go down just to make it?
We probably would.
And my last question was just, in analyzing, 3 and 5 is the intention to, on the commercial side is to really activate that corridor? Are we expecting that all those other buildings that are not part of this element to continue to stay as commercial uses? Is that kind of the idea, as a pedestrian walkway? That corridor?
Which other site?
Sites 3 and 5, where we have a minimum commercial requirement. I'm just worried that we might, a developer might look at that and say that I don't want to build any commercial, I'm building a residential building. Want to make sure that we,
And the ability, state density bonus law through waivers and concessions does allow a concession for a requirement for a commercial.
Mhm.
It's been used fairly recently in some nearby agencies or jurisdictions. So
no, I'm just curious why those sites were picked and the other ones.
Well, I mean, I certainly can speak to 3. Well, both as well, but 3 was all going back to 2016 as part of the Tamil Vista Boulevard, and that was really about trying to create more of a not lose the commercial corridor entirely, have some potential opportunities for, in fact, enlivening that corridor a little bit with some uses that could be commercial. So that said, I think we could say like one of the individuals we've spoken to wants to do 100% affordable senior housing. They've mentioned that as like, that's not something we do as part of those projects. The financing doesn't allow for it. It's basically wasted space. So, but he talked about using potentially a concession through the density bonus law to say, look, we can't do that. We would probably need to utilize that to get a concession. We'd say, all right, well, that's that would be allowed, or we couldn't really say no to that. So in that certain circumstance, it certainly makes sense. I think the idea really was, though, to still, and this speaks to the value of still having sort of the intent in there, even if it's not followed or required to be followed all the time, is that we are trying to, even in that, we say like, is there some sort of public facing use that at least provides some interest for the streetscape as pedestrians are walking by, especially if you, as it builds out with the widened sidewalks and sort of the more trying to tie the residential uses and get people out of their cars and walk maybe to the town center, from there, there's still an opportunity to attract that. It's also, frankly, there's sales tax involved and economic uses. If it's viable, we want to try to allow for that to continue.
I mean, I like the idea. I just want to make sure that we're not
The
precluding any development to happen.
The site over here, the 5, that's partly as a result of the ownership there, being the owner of SF Fitness, and they have own gyms and have expressed interest if they were going to redevelop. That certainly would be part of their program, and other commercial uses, such as they're developing the the animal hospital
Mhm.
use of the base of their building right now. So they're familiar with that concept of how to tie in retail uses. So again, I think it's viable, but it's good. Yeah. Don't know until we know. It's sort of that type of thing, but I think it shows intent of what we're trying to accomplish.
My last question is about the sidewalks. Um, do we have would we have to come up with a new program for if we had to landscape them? Like, is that going to cost the town money? I mean, I like the idea, especially if there's if there's parking on the street, then we're running into problems with, people trampling over the vegetation, but
Yeah, no, I think so. The way it works and the way it would work. So part of the development of these sites, obviously, these are significant construction projects. They would be responsible for building out the sidewalks as part of the project. And then throughout town, as our homeowners know all too well, is the sidewalk adjacent to properties is really the responsibility of the property owners to maintain. And we would likely also need to, as we've discussed with the owners of the hotel, who are proposing redevelopment on Tamil Vista, create some sort of arrangement or license agreement that public has the right to access a certain portion of their property in the front as they create this wider sort of streetscape zone. And so, I think it's part of sort of one thing we can say we want to, as part of this process, get back from the increased density is a more walkable environment for pedestrians and potentially other, we do if at these, not that we want our bicyclists on there, but Tamil Vista Boulevard, as we know, is not it's a narrow roadway. You can do on-street biking, but there's also room to potentially allow for smaller recreational, the family sort of biking experience on these wider sidewalks as well to get to from places point A to B.
that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Dr. Bundy.
Yeah, Martha, I was curious if anybody else has come forward saying they'd like to be included in this. And then also, once this goes forward, property owners can also raise their hand and say, hey, I like this idea. I want to be included.
Well, at this point, it's too late in the process to add sites since the environmental analysis that's been done was based on the sites and the units. But all of the majority of commercial sites in town do already allow residential, just at a much lower density. So there still is potential for property owners to do a residential project at that lower density.
Oh.
And then we actually recently did hear from a property owner who received a notice in the mail that expressed interest in housing at their property.
Okay. The residential senior housing or assisted living housing, do those units count for our RENA numbers?
They do not.
Well, why would we encourage them to come in then?
Well, we've had conversations about it's creating housing and meeting the goals of the needs of the community, and there's a definite need for that type of housing. The way the state counts units to count as part of your RENA is that you need an independent kitchen and living facility. So oftentimes these units do not have that kitchen component, so that's why they do not count. But it is still, it meets the need of the community.
Yeah. And actually, we have a property owner here tonight who we've had some of these discussions on some properties before, whether it was a memory care facility or something that were very much well received as sort of would be a resource for the community. And so that just allowing those to come in to be used and utilized, and these properties to be utilized in such a way, it's not necessarily so much as the change, but just explicitly making clear that it's allowing for that use to occur and through a conditional use process, because it's really more about the employees that you need parking for, and the some other considerations around the uses itself, rather than sort of impacts on structure and things like that.
I mean, just in thinking about location for places like this and the employees that are required, which are often sort of lower income employees that have to travel long distances to get here. Be nice to have these on places where there is public transit getting to them, perhaps located in less expensive property and closer to hospitals even. But I understand that you don't want to preclude these. It's just, is this something that really benefits us overall if we don't get any RENA numbers out of it? That's all.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Daniel,
Thank you. On the Macy's site, what is an enhanced streetscape zone?
So that would include, wider sidewalks, street trees, landscaping, enhancements to improve the walkability of that portion of the
And
site.
have we defined that somewhere?
Just on that graphic showing the hatch marks. And then there's standards kind of throughout the document about landscaping and street trees.
Yeah, and I think the other idea, and this is still to be, we've discussed, but haven't really put pen to paper on it. I mean, one of the ideas there was really to also figure out a way to not have, best way I can describe it is what you don't want, and to not have sort of a blank or long extended facade with that's not broken up, the massing's not broken up by reveals, or there's maybe a maximum length of building. Some of those things that would actually preclude it from just being a big wall of a building. And so we've thought about it in concept. And so certainly if, but that's something we haven't put down on pen to paper, but that's the only difference from really the widened sidewalks is going to be required everywhere. But I think we're trying to also, in this one, given the size of the property itself and how much street frontage, also try to address the building as well and how it comes down to the street.
Yeah, and I think all those things seem right to me. It just would be concerned in reviewing a project, it seems without any better definition.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit, I don't know what to think about the height limitation, particularly in the 25 dwelling unit parcels, because I'm concerned that it's going to recreate, if they do any sort of a gable or hip roof, it's going to create a very flat roof. If you look at the 3-story building and the width of the building and how much height is left for the gable, that we're going to end up with some not so attractive. Now, if you go 5 stories and it's a flat roof, no one's going to see it. And I don't know how to address that, but if there were some way to create, I don't know, just a question, if there's a way to address
We're
that.
trying to address it. Sorry, we've tried to, I think, I'm just thinking if one way in the objective design and development standards was to have the height to the eave be one height, and then you could actually have another height for the top of the roof essentially. And so if it, especially if it angled back toward the center of the building, that sort of structure, that could work. So we haven't considered that yet, but that's certainly potentially something we could consider as a small or a slight adjustment, if the commission thought that was appropriate.
And then I was curious under the vehicle miles traveled, the relationship to the integrated, affordable and below market rate housing, how that reduces vehicle miles travel.
So there's been studies that show that 100% affordable or senior housing, that car ownership tends to be a little bit lower. So then vehicles traveled is lower. And there's a guidebook called the CAPCOA guidebook, I believe, that is essentially a menu of options to reduce vehicle miles traveled per project. And as part of the mitigation in the environmental document, applicants have to choose certain options from this menu in order to be compliant with the environmental document. But so those listed are just some options, and it would be up to each individual developer to select the option for the project, and it needs to be evaluated and approved by the planning department as part of the process.
The goal, yeah, I mean, that's right. I don't really have anything to add other than just that's part of the CEQA analysis now is how do you have projects that what sort of travel demand mitigation or management program that you can put in place to actually try to reduce the number of trips that each of these projects are generating. And through these studies, and then they've assigned certain percentage reduction, and that has been accepted by it's been accepted by through the CEQA analysis process as acceptable ways to mitigate that potential impact.
And you're requiring a landscape area if parking is facing a public street. And did you consider requiring like planting, like 3 feet of planting to cover the grill in front of the vehicles? Because if it's just lawn, I'm not so sure it really accomplishes all that much.
So more of a shrub
Yeah,
vegetation. I believe, I'll double check, but I think turf may not be allowed.
well, ground cover,
Yeah, okay,
whatever.
but we
yeah.
can look into
Yeah.
It's a good idea.
specifying that.
And see, there was one more. Oh, on the landscape section, we specify size of trees, but we never specify quantity. Is there a reason?
So we are planning to include a requirement for how often street trees need to be planted. That didn't make it into this version of the ordinance, so that will be included in future ordinance.
Would that also include like open areas, courtyards or whatever be included, or just street trees?
It probably would just be street trees. There is a requirement for a certain number of trees based on the number of parking spaces within a parking area, and that the trees need to be evenly spaced out. For courtyards, generally they're designed to be, comfortable spaces. So I feel it, landscape architects spend a lot of time and energy designing courtyards to be comfortable. So I don't necessarily think it would be necessary in that case.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. The ordinance says there's a zoning reference for senior definition to 118.5. I didn't look it up. What does that say? Is the definition of senior housing roughly?
So it hasn't been added yet, but it essentially would be, you must be of a certain age, so likely 55 and older, and it would be in an apartment complex. So different from a residential care facility. It's, housing units for seniors. And for those types of projects, we've spoken with a couple developers that do senior only projects, and they tend to be one bedroom, all one bedrooms. But that we're still working on the definition, but it will be included in what you see next month.
Right. Thank you.
Any suggestions? 55 or 62?
Going up, yeah. Comments from HCD? Did we get any?
Not yet. Due date is November 21st.
Right, so nothing,
Nothing yet. We're trying to get a meeting scheduled.
crickets. Okay,
Trust me, we're like, what is going on there? We have a different reviewer than our neighboring jurisdiction. I don't know. It's like, just.
right, okay. What happens with the overlay district and the developer decides to go to the commercial underlying zoning? Does that somehow impact the standing of the HCD or the housing element in some way?
It's sort of the no net loss, provision. So this speaks to, I think, why we're having more units than the 725, which is our arena. Because there are requirements in state law that if we didn't have that, and we were saying just hitting 725 or right around there, and one of our sites doesn't get developed with any housing, you are required to rezone another property to make up for that housing that's lost and go through this CEQA analysis, for that process, for that property. And again, sort of ensure that it can also meet for each income level that I think the original site was sort of zoned for individually. So that's a cumbersome process to have to jump into, just because somebody develops a commercial project on a existing commercial site. So in any case, that speaks to why we have these, but it's called a buffer. The total number of units we're including in the rezoning process. So it doesn't, but it won't. It doesn't affect what we're trying to do now, I think, in terms of get a compliant housing element. Our housing element will not become non-compliant because if in that scenario, we will likely fall behind in terms of our keeping up with the number of units we're trying to build over this decade. But I think we're anticipating that's going to happen in any case, at a certain point. And that will just mean that we're subject to certain state laws like SB 35, which has by right provisions and things like that when that happens.
The 20% inclusionary is sort of written in stone now, right?
Yes.
Right. Have you had any feedback that that's too high given the current economy and so forth? Or people are saying, that's out of range?
Yeah, no specific feedback on the inclusionary. We've been sharing it with folks and haven't gotten any.
It's kind of the standard around. Yeah, okay. Well, we've got a patient audience here. So it's 8:15. Let's hear from our audience who wants to speak. I'm hoping. Would you step up to the microphone, please? And that up there? Yes.
Oh, it's a small room.
We're recording. We got people on the.
I have a question for Martha or Adam. The designated units per 10 properties that you have identified, it says per acre. So if a property is 3 acres and the designation is 35, so they can build 105?
Go ahead, Adam.
Thanks.
If that's okay to take a direct question like that, that's a little unusual. But do you have other things you want to ask, or is that your question?
Can I have an answer?
So it's based on the net area of land. So there's a definition that describes things that are removed from the site area, and then whatever you're left with, that's what you use to determine density. So for instance, the Black Kettle Lagoon is located on your property, and per the definition of net area lagoon, waterways and wetlands are removed from that site area. So then the density allowed would be based on the total minus the size of the lagoon, and then that equals an acre. So then that determines the allowable density.
Okay, I don't agree with that, but okay. How about FARs? Because in this discussion, there was never mention of FARs.
So for the way the ordinance is structured is density is being established for residential components, and then floor area ratio, both a minimum for some sites and then a maximum for all sites are being established, and that controls the commercial component. So for all sites except for site 10, the Macy's site, the maximum FAR is 20%. And then for the Macy's site, the maximum is 34%.
What does that mean, 20%?
So it's based on, again, the site area times 20%. So if it's 1 acre site, then it would be 20% of that. So
That doesn't make sense.
About 8,000 square feet.
but again, there's the option to not use the overlays and to do a commercial only project, in which case, whatever the FAR is in the underlying zoning, which for most sites is 34%, that would be
Right,
used.
yeah, okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you. All right. Who else would like to step up and say something or ask a question, if it may be? Anybody? No. Okay, Tracy, do you have any hands up in the,
Yes, there is a hand up on the Zoom. It's Corey Calfee. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. You should be able to talk.
Good evening. My name is Corey Calfee and I'm with Optera Law and I represent Nugget Market, Inc. We sent in a letter in August and again today, and I'm here now to share our comments live. We're requesting that you remove Opportunity Site 2 at 5651 Paradise Drive from the list of housing opportunity sites and from the rezoning effort. There's really no possibility of this site being redeveloped during the housing element planning period. And that's because of the shared property rights at this location. Most of the site is private property, and it's part of the Paradise Shopping Center. The shopping center relies on shared parking in the existing lot that faces on Paradise Drive. And there's a recorded parking easement over a lot of that site, and it runs in perpetuity. So in other words, Nugget, that operates the grocery store in the shopping center, has a long-term right to use that site, and the site can't simultaneously be used for housing. And it's for this reason that we're asking you to remove the site from the housing element and that you not rezone it for housing. It's really being fully utilized for commercial purposes now, and redevelopment isn't expected. So we appreciate your help with this and your important work on the housing element, and we're looking forward to more discussions on this point with your staff next week. Thank you.
thank you very much. Okay. Anybody else in the queue there?
No one else.
No one else? Okay, so going once, twice. Public open time is gonna close here since we don't have any hands up. So, all right. Thank you. So that puts before the administration here a question. I don't know if you want to answer it now or you want to put that off on what happens with that site and how that affects anything.
Yeah, I think the next step is we'll just meet, we're gonna meet with the
Up there a lot.
yeah, Ms. Calfee and representing the Nugget and have further conversations about this. I think our thought was that a project might not encroach into the parking area. It would just redevelop that gym and maybe push back into the side. The town has a couple of small properties to the west, and there is room in behind it. And so it could have essentially just remain existing commercial space where it is, and maybe a couple of stories above that to get
Sure.
a couple of housing. So that was the idea, not that it would actually redevelop a site, the property would redevelop the actual existing parking lot, but to be continued and clarified and maybe, we'll further discuss.
Okay, well, that's informative. The construct of what it might look like affects whether,
Yeah. I mean, we, obviously, that's one of many possibilities, but certainly if there are constraints on the parking lot, then the property owner might decide to just do what our thought was, which was to, again, do like
Yeah.
existing.
Right.
And the setback, the sort of the regulations, that development standards that we proposed or drafted would allow for that sort of construction or development project.
okay, well, thank you for that. That's helpful information. So at this point in time, we have the opportunity to start a discussion or to take a break. Are you okay, Margaret or Jim?
I'm fine.
Yeah,
I'm fine. Why are you?
over on the right here, Daniel, Bob? Good. Okay, all right, so we'll continue with this.
Oh, okay. I'll accept that.
So it's a interesting item to tackle in discussion. But, you know, you've got the lay of the land here in terms of the HE 1, 2, and 3, and the heights and the different elements of this thing. I'm just gonna throw it open here and say, who's got the most to say? Anybody?
I have some questions.
Yes, please.
Is there any restriction or consideration of how the residential units would be developed, as far as would they need to be rentals? Could they be sold as condominiums? Is there any thought about that? No.
There's no requirements that it be a for sale or rental project. There's also no requirements about unit mix, bedroom counts.
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of left more to the market.
And is there any, I mean, I'm thinking about what Bob said, and I actually am wondering if something is developed for senior residential care because there's no kitchen in it, or it couldn't be used to fill the house. Is there any way to petition the state for some consideration of that, given the fact that it seems to me it shows a bias in the government and for a protected group? Being the attorney.
Would you
A
like to join us in
protected group.
crafting that argument? No, there's several cities I know have raised this with the State Department of Housing and Community Development, and I think it's an ongoing discussion, but it's certainly, there's been no legislation to this point to change the fact that they are essentially defining a dwelling unit in a certain way, and these types of places where people live are not also dormitories, like where you have college dormitories as well, are not necessarily defined as dwelling units either, but they certainly meet a housing need for certain people. So it's just an ongoing discussion. I don't know if there's any organized sort of lobbying going on from certainly not from our American Planning Association or League of California Cities. I think it's down the list a little bit, but that's, yeah, I know Centerfell at one point, they had conversations with HCDs at the level because they were developing a project. I think actually there's whistle stop projects being developed as well right now. So it's an ongoing sort of question and conversation, but hasn't gotten to the point where they've conceded anything in that regard.
I would suggest contacting AARP. I just think that it's, considering the fact that it is meeting a community need and a state need, it needs to go further than just
It's not, I guess what I would
passive
say,
discussion.
there's two different, one is certainly it's meeting a community need. I don't think anybody would argue that, and it may even be considered housing, but under housing element law, whether you count it or not towards this RENA is sort of a separate sort of legal, I don't know, legislative discussion of how they develop that legislation.
One thing to keep in mind is that RENA really only concerns itself with income levels of the household also. Many of the institutions that we're talking about are very expensive. And RENA is looking for the development of housing for people who are of modest means. So that would be another constraint on accepting some of these housing as meeting a RENA need. Now, as to whether or not they meet the definition of housing under housing element law, that's a different matter. The housing element law does require that the housing element address the need for housing among every sector of the society based on age, family size, income also, of course, but the RENA numbers only look at the income level of the household.
Anything else that you wanted to ask?
Asking, no. That was the end of my asking. I have comments or.
Okay.
The one thing that I think that would be helpful, at least the way I see it. And it just, with the zones, the overlaying, and all the different rules and the man who made a comment sort of underlined it, is it seems like all this is, I don't know a better word, fractionalizing pieces of Corte Madera. And so if someone wanted to develop something, you have to look here, 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 here. And I think, I don't know exactly how I can sort of visualize something, but there needs to be some kind of roadmap that's a graphic, like if this, then this. And these are the rules. If this, then this, and these are the rules. It would help us here knowing what we have to address and what we have no power over or no comment for. And I think it would help developers if they came in and they were kind of deciding which direction they needed to go and how they could best get there.
I think, yeah, and I totally agree. One, it would be on the process, but I think two, that the map is really intended to be the guide. And that's why ultimately that will become important, where somebody looks at their property or the property they're interested in and can find there's the underlying zoning, but there's also the overlay there as well. And so once you go to that particular part of the code, the housing element overlay district, you'll land here, and we're going to try to label also. That's where you try to color it as like HE1, HE2, HE3. So it sort of tries to be the organizing, but why the map's really important at the end of the day. And it's, but ours is getting very busy. So we are actually engaging with one of our consultants in this process and potentially some additional scope of work to help us sort of clean up our zoning map. Maybe
I think
go
that's
to
a
two different
great
maps that's just easier to read a little bit, but point well taken.
I had some, I don't know if we're supposed to. You want comments about the specific regulations that are here?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. I don't understand number 18.18.1160. It doesn't make kind of sense to me. A preliminary and
1160?
precise plan shall not be required in the housing element overlay district.
It's inside baseball, but yeah. No, I know. So you want to answer that one?
No, you can take this one.
So we have this provision in the beginning of our overlay district, section 1818. So the general provisions, anytime you're in an overlay district, you are required to apply for a preliminary and a precise plan. And we've talked about those in certain projects in the past, but that's just a general requirement. And then as I think it's an extra layer, frankly, I think goes back to a time when we were planning large sections of town with larger subdivisions and bigger projects, where that may have been appropriate. But there's no need to do that for individual projects on these individual sites. And that was done actually for the mixed use gateway overlay district, which was the Tam Ridge project. They also didn't have that project go through a preliminary and a precise plan. So it's not necessary. And so it really just removes that layer of
So
application.
I don't get it. What, people just come in and say, gee, I have an idea. And you say, that's good, but we don't really need a precise plan. Tell me what your idea is.
Yeah,
Does-
well, no, so a precise plan is essentially design review anyways.
Okay.
It's, so they would come in and request a design review permit is how the process would work, but they wouldn't need to do a preliminary plan, which is sort of a very conceptual, it was meant for more like when they were building the village or the town center, they had preliminary plans, which are sort of, we want to put things here. Generally, these are the types of uses, plus that, then we'll move to the next step. Frankly, we've actually, since as long as I've been here, we've combined both the preliminary and precise plan process into one. And it ends up just being a design review with, but we add multiple different permits on top of it for, which don't really help the process in any way. So it's, we still actually, even though we don't have, we have a design review permit, we still do have a requirement here that there is a preliminary review study session before the planning commission.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
Because you use the word shall require there.
Yeah.
And I thought earlier in the discussion, you said you were going to request people, you would, it wasn't a requirement. Shall require is very strong language.
Yeah. We can, I think, right now, and it gets very complicated because of the different rules, but there is a opportunity to for a developer to choose sort of the process in a way that they want to follow. Not actually, the process is going to be the same at some point. Right now, we are allowed to, we have sort of a consistent process. We are limited to 5 hearings pursuant to the Housing Accountability Act. So I think all this is saying is that one of those hearings, we want it to be a study session. And I don't think there's anything there's nothing wrong with doing that would prevent us from doing that as far as I'm aware. Once, let me just say, once we are, fall behind on actually build, the number of units that are built in Corte Madera, once we don't keep up with our RENA, if somebody wanted to come in with a Senate Bill 35 project, that would likely change. And I would say we probably don't have that level of, wouldn't require these certain things to be followed because it's more of a ministerial process for approving projects. Nonetheless, I will turn it over to Anna.
I fundamentally agree with Adam. Right now, you can still hold a hearing, even if the extent to which you can exercise discretion is extremely limited. You can still engage in dialogue over the project. We haven't.
Can you require it is the.
You can require the hearing, and at the hearing, you talk and they listen, and if you ask them to respond, they can respond. Whether or not you can actually require them to make changes, it's going to depend very much on the specifics. But as you know, the trend in state law has been to limit your ability to do that.
I mean, it's not housing, but we did require a preliminary study session, preliminary review for the planning commission as part of the hotel ordinance as well. So it's.
I have just one last question about the Macy's site. When that site was first developed, and it was when I was here, they spent a year that was all fill. And they spent a year just letting it sink, basically. And then they built on it. but there was a lot of environmental stuff and requirements that went on during that time. Is that, is there any environmental requirement now that they reevaluate that site for building?
Yeah, I mean, not from a typical environment, but geotechnical, certainly the soil condition and geotechnical work will is a big part of what they all need to do in order to actually build on that site. But it's not in the sense of like you know, it's an already developed site, it's already been disturbed, it's not like a impacting any of the wildlife or things like that, you know. We are evaluating all that though through the CEQA document, which is evaluating sort of the potential environmental impacts of building on these sites. But that's a fundamental premise built in to that review is that these are all already developed properties. And so you're redeveloping properties. So of course, you know, you always have to deal with if their soil is contaminated or something like that, you're going to have to deal with that as you build. But that's sort of down the road in the process. You're not dealing with sort of mitigating other types of concerns that you typically think of environmental.
I guess my concern is that that's right on the marsh. And you're thinking of putting up a huge building.
Yeah.
And that's really, I guess what I just want to say, it bothers me. I'm sure it'll bother the egrets. I don't know what can be done. I'm just putting it out there.
The development is contained to the site.
Yeah, it's there's a ring road around it. Yeah, it's certainly a certain in from a buffer standpoint, a distance away from many of the actual protected areas, you know, that are preserved. You know, we went through that certainly with the when RH gallery was built and whatnot. But you know, these are, anyways, it's yeah, it's contained within the site. But nonetheless, you can have concerns about it. I understand. What I was going to say something else, but
I guess
Okay.
what I'm thinking is this building is going to be twice the size of RH. Is height wise.
what 1.5, I would say. I think. It's about
Okay.
1.5.
Pretty tall.
Yeah, no doubt, and you know, I know that's where sort of review of that in the environmental document. I can't remember if there were provisions like in that were included in there for the height of the building related to birds, but certainly it's a I don't want to dismiss it. It's a significant size building. It's, you know, if it's maxed out at its highest height, it would be the tallest building in Corte Madera. So there's no way around that, certainly. But I think we do through the process, and this is again, we're in a position where we'd be needing to work with a developer, and that's it's important is bringing in a good developer who cares about design. And we've been through that with the hotel project, I think, and somebody who can work with the town through that process is ultimately can get to a design solution. I think it's, while big, it will, you know, and there's no way getting around that. But again, it's about accomplishing certain housing goals. It's on a site where a lot of the units, if you don't build it there, it's going to be dispersed, you know, elsewhere throughout town and higher densities. So it's away from residential. You know, we've identified it as really because of all that, it is the one location where it sort of has the least amount of potential impacts on based on the criteria, you know, that we've talked about through the process. So in that regard, we just have to, I think, recognize it and then hopefully use our processes through through the design, get a good builder in, make sure it's quality. And also enhances frankly the center itself, which is a real possibility, I think, through what we heard from Macerich and how they see residential really helping the center in the long run in terms of being a good tax base for the town and so on. So
Okay,
Thank you.
well, then we can move on to Mr. Rizzo. See what you have on your mind.
Do we have a master plan of like, it's like what Margaret was talking about? Do we have like a master plan where we've designed the streetscapes and these are our sections of town, like this is what Minky Park's gonna look like, this is what, because we're doing all these beautiful public works projects with bikes and trees and, you know, creating these great sections, but I agree with Margaret a little bit, like the overlay district might want to be like the whole Tamil Vista, make it easy. Is there an opportunity? When's the next opportunity for property owners to get on rezoning? Our next, I mean, we still know, I'm like, is this, are we talking next
Well, they-
cycle or is?
they could do it at any time, really, but then the work's on them, you know, and to
Okay.
do the work. So you are talking next cycle, and this is really unfortunately, the sort of the reverse part of the housing element law is that it's actually a disincentive to create a bunch of housing opportunity sites that you don't use, because then next time around, you're penalized for actually including them in you have to go to you lose your process.
Mhm.
For example, the next time around, if you've identified a housing opportunity site that actually doesn't get developed with
Mhm.
housing, and if you want to reuse it
Yeah.
next time around, you actually lose your ability to, and I'm going to look to Martha and make sure lose your ability to actually have your design review process. It becomes a by right.
I'm not talking about identifying the sites, but just putting them in the overlay district. I mean, is that still identifying the site as housing, or I mean, I'm just curious about
So rezone,
the overlay district. I think it's really smart what you guys did, by the way, of kind of reverse engineering it. Leaving the commercial, because who people might want to leave it commercial. And people and have the opportunity to do a mixed use building and a residential building. I think it's brilliant, but.
No, I think theoretically you're right. We could rezone larger swaths of the town. I think it's just looking at it now, it may sound like an easy proposition when you're starting off talking about appealing arena and the challenges of even thinking about 725 units rezoning. You rezone all the sites, you're really talking about rezoning for a couple thousand units. And I think the question we didn't want to at the time, I think about that was a real question that we felt was easy to justify. But so, and I think that, that boils down to where we landed, which, again, there are more properties than sort of the bare minimum that we needed to rezone. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly something to look at moving forward. I think once we, because it would help to just not have to redo this every 8 years, and so certainly.
Like, I would think that, I know you guys have a vision of what these street corridors, and I know Daniel's chomping at the bit for this because we've got all these beautiful streets and you can see them developing, but we don't really have, the designs and the actual master plan of the whole town, and kind of this is this section, this is what we really would like it to be. We want to connect Minky Park with this retail section and activate this with pedestrians and
Right,
that
right.
sort of.
There
Urban
was a specific plan for the San Clemente area that was done, I think it was 79 or something. 70s, and they did just that, the sections, the street sections, the
Uh-huh.
landscape requirements, the tree planting, the setbacks. So
I don't want Martha to get nervous because we don't have to talk about it more. I was just curious if you had had a master plan or there was one maybe in the works in the future would be something that would be very interesting. Maybe look at in the future. And as far as the overlay district and having just like the attorney that's representing Nugget, it would seem to me that particular site, it's up to ownership what they want to do with the site. Nugget's is renting the site, and I would think anybody developing would want an anchor tenant anyway. So I think it's a plus for everybody, and it does give the building owners an option to add housing or not add housing. It's still a commercial site, so I don't see the harm in keeping the overlay district myself. And then, kind of, I think I would love for the parking requirement for the guest parking maybe to be relaxed a little bit. I think that's going to definitely prohibit some developments to pencil out. And then lastly, I know you guys are talking to developers about heights and what they can get in there, but Daniel brought up a really good point. Like developers have a formula. There's a double loaded corridor. It's 40 feet wide or whatever the building is. And then there's a minimum pitch of a roof. And we should try to figure out how many stories you want to build, quite frankly. A lot of these properties are in flood districts and flood zones that are going to either require us to build them up. But I think most people will probably wind up building commercial because it's probably going to pencil out better for them to have a level of commercial down there rather than. But I would almost look at this as how many stories we could build and then come up with the height and then kind of work those setbacks from there on the upper floors.
And the odds toolkit does have height or stories, maximum stories, and then height requirements as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think we discussed that and just didn't end up going that route.
But sorry, Martha, I guess my point is we've got a small section of a storefront and it doesn't really take in effect the actual width of a building, which is what kind of is the hardship in developing, because you have a roof that you have to deal with, and then you also have the story to story. And in larger buildings, you typically have a larger story to story because we've got all the infrastructure that needs to run between the stories. So I guess my comment is maybe to work a little bit more with the developers to figure out what is actually doable for the amount of stories that we want to achieve to get to density.
Yeah, and I think we tried it. Opticos definitely did that in their massing models. And so, but that's sort of what we try to do with the 50 feet, which was the sort of the 4-story building over, you do a 3 over podium, which is what they did at Tam Ridge essentially.
I mean, that Macy's site's so big, nobody's going to build a big, massive building. It's going to be a series of smaller buildings, I would say, that are going to have corridors. They're never going to get any light into any of the units. So I think either you're going to have a platform of commercial, and then you're going to have a series of buildings. I don't see how else you can get that to work. But I do think 70 feet starting to get really high. From the highway, the town center is fine, but I think you're talking about another 18 feet. 10 feet?
Yeah, it's about 10,
About
10
10
to the
feet?
max. And that's where I think the idea was trying to at least push it
Mhm.
towards the center of that site or back away, so it was and trying to use some step up to it, if possible. So.
Well, I guess I'd just like to see the rationale on the height. Like, are we trying to get a 5-story building in here? Are we trying to get a 6-story building in here? Like, what, how did we come up with the 70 feet, I guess? And Peter, that's all I have.
But that's sort of like, I'm just asking, that's clarity on those models and finding more what the story makeup is in
Mhm.
order to, yeah, I get it, yeah.
Mhm. Especially with the
Yeah, I
setbacks on
think-
the upper floor is gonna make a big difference. On
I think the challenge with and maybe what we can do is given the fact that Macy's is looking at the site themselves, they can provide some feedback on their thinking and how, very at a conceptual stage, how they're thinking about it, but certainly flexibility was one of the, it is such a big
Mhm.
site. There's so many ways that you could probably develop a project there, and so many different programs that you could potentially arrange around that site. That becomes very hard, but given that, they are working conceptually on some of this thinking around it, maybe it's helpful to hear from them how they are viewing the height and needs for the site to do something that they think is
Mhm.
possible there, their architect anyways.
Macy's site is currently allowed to build how many units?
300.
Okay.
I mean,
I mean,
Oh, currently.
Yeah.
currently,
Oh, much less. It's, I think 7.5 units an acre,
okay.
fraction of that.
It's over the entire village essentially, so,
Ah,
but they
okay.
only own, obviously their portion of the property.
Got it. All right. Dr. Bundy.
Martha, I want to thank you for all your hard work on this. We're between a rock and a hard place. We've got RENA on one side and by right development on the other, and I appreciate you keeping Corte Madera in compliance with the state mandates and everything. I do just want to add on to the parking issue at the Paradise Shopping Center with Nugget and 5 Points Fitness. I remember when the Paradise with the Paradise Market was originally developed. It was a failing strip mall that really was in disarray, was terrible, and what was called the World Gym at the time complained that they didn't want to see this develop because they wanted an underused parking lot so that all of their patrons would have no trouble parking and going to the gym. So they actually objected to what was just a commercial development replacing an existing commercial development. So given that I shop there regularly and realize how often the parking lot is almost totally filled, I think this needs to be looked at very carefully. That's my only comment.
Bob. No. Okay. Daniel.
Well, I would just reiterate what Bob said. I think you've done a really good job. I think the overlay district really makes sense. A few nitpicky things about landscape and this and that, but overall, I think it makes sense. The one thing that coming back, I think, to the Macy's site, I do feel that that's the one site that I think is going to be a bit of a shock to the community when it's built. And I think that I think it's really great that they have someone working on this. We really haven't studied it ourselves. I mean, is 70 feet really required to get 40 DUs per acre on that site? Would we give up some of that open space because we got the mall there in order to have 60 feet instead of 70 feet? And I don't feel like I have the information to say that, particularly on the Macy's site, we've really done a good job of defining, what's going to be acceptable there to the community. So I'm hopeful that with your dialogue with them, we can get more information and hopefully feel comfortable with what we do. But thank you for your work. That's it.
Daniel, okay, thank you. It is a really good document that has simplicity in it. You guys had conversations with other municipalities during this or not, or
Not particularly.
they're all over the roadmap. Look at what other communities are doing. It's each to his own, it seems like. Wild West out there. Um, so what are you guys worried about with this document? Anything in particular, moving forward?
There's a couple standards we still are interested in adding, especially for the Macy's site, adding some sort of standard related to articulation and mass. That's something Adam and I have talked about, and we just haven't been able to come to a standard we think will achieve what we're trying to achieve. So that's something we're going to, continue to look at based on comments. We'll evaluate parking for the guest parking and look at some other codes in the area to see if that should be reduced. And, there's some additional standards relating to like the tree spacing that Commissioner Kenny brought up. So there's still some fine tuning that we plan to do. And also with, conversations with property owners, there's maybe some kind of minor tweaks here and there.
Right. Your list of development standards that you showed at the beginning of the evening for ET 1, 2, and 3 is pretty simple. And I worry from my perspective that it's not got enough that a developer would walk in the door and say, well, your document doesn't say I can't do that or that I have to do this. Is that a worry that's too thin, that you'd be open to somebody arguing with you or taking you to task for not having enough?
Yeah, no, I think, so, there's it does, I think, have a lot of, I don't want to, on the one hand of the spectrum, right, you have like the objective design and development standards, which are a whole host of things that you're required to do that are just going to give you a certain type of building. And require you to develop a site in a certain way. I worry about that being too constraining and being a sort of, it's not intended to, it was really intended to streamline, but everything is so site specific, or everything is not site specific. So when you actually go out and you get an architect looking at a particular site with these curves and different street frontages, that becomes a sort of a barrier or challenge for people to meet. On the other hand, is our current zoning rules, which are very, it's just like minimum setback, maximum height, which is, and go at it really and use the design review to sort of put in place, mold and shape things. We're more certainly on that end of the spectrum. But I think we did want to highlight certain things that have been focus of the commission, frankly, in the past, is important for whether it's the sidewalks and streetscape frontage, the landscaping requirements, lighting, and hit on those sorts of things in a more specific and exact way than some of our current standards sort of require. At the same time, it does allow within the envelope flexibility, and so I think that is true. And I think our thinking, at least, is that one, it's hard to get into writing rules for, as we saw with the objective design and development standards. We do want to pull in what we can, for example, at the Macy's site, because there is some good stuff in there in the architectural section, I think. So we're looking at that. But the other sites allow for some flexibility within the envelopes to, our hope is that they're molded through some of the, not but they come through our process, and we have, as we've done before through many different projects, they're commented on, and typically we're getting good quality designers on board, and they can use the flexibility to sort of create good projects. You know, so that was the strategy, the overall what we tried to do. Tamil, you know, certain sites, site 3, Tamil Vista, we talked about, we already had some pretty good development standards through the MX1 zoning, so we tried to really stay true to it and concept to those different heights in the neighborhood zone, higher height in the back towards the highway. Certain streetscape requirements there, tried to stay true to that concept there as well. Pulling buildings forward in certain sites versus others. So but anyways, that's where we landed. And I don't know, we have step backs above the certain stories, which we, you know, haven't really included or don't currently require anywhere. So any other?
You know, at some point, we will be subject to SB 35. So I think at that point, it makes sense to have a kind of a broader discussion of, do we want to get more prescriptive in some of these architectural requirements that were included in the Objective Design and Development Standards Toolkit? But at this point, since we're still able to utilize the design review process, we think, you know, it's a process that works and that improves design through, you know, input of the commission. So I think for now, we think the approach works.
Well, writing more regulations, it's just time and money. Staff time and more money and time. But
Well,
it's a lot.
I would ask for an urban designer.
Yeah.
Anyway, you know, to that point, yeah, you've not gotten a lot of substantive commentary out of us tonight, but I think that what you have heard some opinions and some ideas and some thoughts that could use massaging and fill in your document. Otherwise, it's a great document. I think everybody likes it. Yeah. The job well done. So,
We can live with that. That's
And I also would too like to thank, we have a
yes.
consulting planner, Alvin Jen, who's been working with us the last couple of months, and he helped with a lot of the graphics that were included in the presentation. So I'd like to acknowledge his work.
great, okay. So unless there's something else with this item that we want to address, we can close this item, right? Okay. And Bob, you got a big fat packet there. Did you have a meeting to report on?
Yeah, the November 1st town council meeting. They had a closed session, reviewed our interim town manager and offered him a full-time position, which I hope he takes. So that was the most important part of the meeting. The other part was getting us in compliance with international building code that the state of California has adopted, and particularly in relationship to energy requirements. We previously talked about no gas hookups for new homes. They would be all electric, and some issues with people that are getting panel upgrades, where those would also be compatible with EV charging, even if they weren't doing EV charging at the time. The biggest area of concern that was brought up that I also had concerns about was the remodel, and 750-foot remodel, and requiring some energy upgrades associated with that. I think the definition of 750 square feet interior or in addition was not clearly set out. I think I had some concerns that this was just going to put a lot more work on the planning department to try to, you know, determine what energy efficiency upgrades need to be taken into consideration. And I think there's a concern on the part of homeowners that if there was a requirement that they replace their new gas water heater or new gas furnace, with electric, there would be a lot of pushback and for only, sort of marginal benefit as far as reducing our carbon footprint. This was the recommendation of our climate adaptive program to adopt this. Adam, I know, is taking it back to later this coming year or sometime in the summer. So I guess we'll hear more about it, but I'll turn that over to you for further comment.
Yeah, just so the ordinance that's before the town council for adoption on Tuesday will just apply to new construction, new buildings. And what was discussed as coming back next year, by summer of next year, was an ordinance that would also trigger energy upgrades, not necessarily all new electric, but energy upgrades to existing buildings, existing residences, if there were a substantial remodel. In this case, the definition that the county's using is a 750 square foot of new floor area or alteration of floor area. And so that's where I think staff felt that we just wanted to make sure we had more outreach on that part of the ordinance or model code. And so that was, the council agreed that we should do some more outreach. I mentioned I probably would want that to come before the commission just for your input as well. And the Climate Action Committee certainly is going to be part of that process as well.
All else, Bob?
That was the biggie.
Yeah, there's no other reports from anybody else, right? I don't think. All right. Planning staff.
I'll do one and then, but just on the sort of related, we are closing in on hiring a climate action and adaptation coordinator, which I'm very excited about, and likely we'll be starting the first week in December. And when that happens, I'll be sure to make sure you're aware who that is and introduce her to all of you. As it's a position that's really interrelated to all the different departments. It will actually be reporting to the town manager's office, but it's, obviously climate action and adaptation touches planning, building, public works, park and rec, all our departments in some way, depending on what we're actually what goals we're trying to accomplish. So I think having her experience all the different commissions and committees and how they operate are helpful, but she'll also be staffing the Climate Action Committee specifically.
Okay, so that's it from the planning department?
And then just one announcement that the second meeting in November is being shifted to that 5th Tuesday because of the Thanksgiving break.
Yeah, we're after.
It's what?
It's the November 29th, the 5th Tuesday.
And happy Thanksgiving.
Wait, I have one
good. Yeah.
in the minutes. I have a
Oh,
correction to
good.
make.
Of course. Yeah, hadn't gotten there, but go right ahead.
Okay, so in the reports, announcements and requests, the last sentence wasn't exactly what I said. So it's the scholarship fund wasn't just for adult programs. It was a scholarship fund, and included in that fund would be adult programs. But the scholarship fund covered all the programs. So I didn't want anyone to get the wrong impression.
Could you repeat the date that it's the commission is?
So it's November 29th. It's the fifth Tuesday of the month.
And do we typically have commission on December 23rd? Because that's
It will just have one meeting in December 13th.
We're gonna propose canceling that meeting.
27.
Second, and
December 20, I think it's 20th, actually.
27th.
Oh,
that's- that's- oh,
that's right. It's, yeah,
Yeah.
certainly we are canceling.
So there'll be a meeting. So the next couple meetings are November 29th and then December 13th. This will be the last two meetings of the year.
Bob,
With the corrections mentioned by Margaret, I move that we approve the minutes of the planning commission meeting of October 25th, 2022.
Second,
4 of you have been voted, yes, I'm abstaining.
All in favor?
Aye.
Right.
I would say hopefully congratulate you not announcing anything.
We adjourn this meeting. Thank you very much.